The wind came first, it always did, up on the high moors, a low, lateral thing that cut across the ridgeline and made the dead grass hiss like something breathing. Sergeant Marin Voss had spent enough time in enough broken places to know the difference between wind that meant nothing and wind that carried a warning. This one carried a warning. She pressed herself flat against the granite shelf and waited. 20 meters to her left, Daco was doing the same. She could see the pale oval of his face turning toward her in the gray morning light, his eyes asking the question his mouth knew better than to voice. She gave him the hand signal for hold and watched his face go still and professional again. Good soldier, Daco. Knew when to stop being a person and become a weapon. Below them, the valley was wrong. That was the only word Marin had for it, even now 3 days into whatever this was. Wrong. The grass was flat, dead in a wide circle around the thing in the center. A sphere, gunmetal gray, about the size of a cargo container, sitting in the hollow between two hills, like something that had been placed there very deliberately. Not crashed, not fallen, placed. The soil around it was scorched in a pattern she'd never seen from any engine she'd worked with, and she'd worked with most of them. The Galsec Colonial Survey had sent 7 of them down. There were 4 left. She thought about Zach first, the way she always did when the count came up short. He'd been the youngest of them, 23, with the habit of whistling half a bar of something tuneless when he was nervous. She'd heard it the moment before it stopped. Just stopped. 1 second, the whistle, the next second, nothing. And when they found him, he looked like a man who'd been taken apart at the molecular level and then put back together wrong. The kind of wrong that a medic couldn't fix because there was no name for what had been done to him. The kind of wrong that made Eric, who had seen plenty, go very quiet and look at his hands for a long time. Eric was gone now too. Taken in the night, or what passed for night on this wrecked planet, this abandoned Earth that the colony ships had left behind 5,000 years ago like a husk. There'd been a sound, something mechanical, something with cables and servos, and then Eric was simply absent from his position, his bedroll still shaped to the ghost of him. Prisoner. That was what Roth said. Roth was the one who'd come to them 2 days ago, stumbling down the hillside with his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold his own ration pack. He'd been part of a different survey team, Galsec 7, and he looked like he'd lived a year in 3 days. What he told them, Marin had spent most of the time since trying not to fully believe. An alien, not rogue human, not colonial militia, not some malfunctioning automated system left over from the abandonment. An alien, one of them, Roth said, but it moved like all of them. Compact and armored, the face flat and broad under a helmet that looked like it had grown there, and it spoke. Actually spoke. In something that ran through a translation device, so smooth it came out as clipped, flat military English, and what it said was always some variant of the same sentence. The results are consistent with prior data. You may continue the experiments, Ruth said. That was the word it used. Experiments. He'd told Marin about the water deprivation test first, because that was the one he'd survived. They'd tied him spread eagle in the open and given him nothing for 2 days, monitoring. And the alien had stood at intervals and dictated notes into a device at its belt. When it was done with that phase, it had unshackled Roth and he had run because there was nothing else to do. Because running was the only remaining option, and he'd found Marin's team by luck or desperation. The other experiments he described last. His voice went very flat when he did. Marin listened and didn't look at her people's faces, because she knew if she looked, she'd see the particular kind of horror that could hollow a unit out from the inside. And they needed to stay solid. They needed to stay capable. She was the ranking officer. That meant something. She'd decided it still meant something even here. Even with the sphere in the valley and Zach whistling his last half bar of nothing. And this thing that moved through the hills like a hunter who already knew where all the prey was going to be. She pulled the monocular from her chest rig and glassed the sphere again. Nothing moved. That was the other thing about it. The sphere didn't need to move. The alien, Roth called it Steyr, said it had named itself that, or that was the closest the translation came, had a robot. A collector, Marin called it in her head, because that was what it was. A mechanical thing on multiple legs, fast over rough terrain, equipped with cable launchers, and enough grip strength to carry a full-grown adult. Steyr stayed near the sphere and sent the collector out to bring things to him. And when the collector came back with someone, the experiments began. Marin knew what the experiments were for. She'd known since Roth finished talking, since the picture assembled itself whether she wanted it to or not. You didn't need a tactical qualification to read the intelligence operation. Someone, this Steyer, this field major of whatever army sent him, was preparing a report, testing limits. How much heat could a human body handle before it stopped being useful? How much cold? How long without water, without food, without sleep? What were the specific phobias that shut down decision-making fastest? What was the threshold between damage that a human could operate through and damage that took them out? Pre-invasion survey. The word had weight. She felt it the way she felt altitude as a pressure in the chest. There was a fleet somewhere, waiting on this report. She lowered the monocular and looked at Daco. 2 hours before they send someone to check on us, she said, keeping her voice below the wind. If we haven't reported, they'll send a search team down on the transmat. And then they'll have more subjects, Daco said. Yes, so we handle this ourselves. Yes, he was quiet for a moment. The wind shifted, and the dead grass hissed, and somewhere below them, deep in the valley, something moved against the side of the sphere. Marin put the monocular up again and saw the collector returning. Its legs were folded down in the loose, ground-eating lope it used over flat terrain, and it was carrying something over its primary grips that she had to look at twice before she recognized as a person. Kranz. She knew his jacket. He was limp, but she could see the irregular twitch of breathing, the way his head moved with the collector's gait. Alive. For now, for whatever that was worth in the context of what Steyer was going to do with him. Marin put the monocular away. Tell me again about the sphere, she said to Roth, who was flat behind her, his chin on his forearms. The door, the power supply, how long it stays closed after he goes in. Roth's jaw tightened. You want to go down there. I want you to tell me about the sphere, he told her. She listened with the part of her mind that cataloged and organized, while the other part worked on the problem the way she'd always worked on problems. Sideways, approaching the shape of it from angles that the obvious solution had left uncovered. The obvious solution was superior firepower, but they didn't have it. Steyer was armored in something that Daco's pulse rifle had already proven ineffective on, in the encounter on day one that had cost them their first team member. Direct confrontation was not the answer. What they had was a sphere with a door that had a cycle time. A power relay that had to be manually connected for the revitalization process that Steyer needed every few hours to maintain function in Earth's gravity. A translation device on Steyer's belt that functioned as both communication and record-keeping. And Roth, who had survived the water deprivation and knew the layout of the area around the sphere because he'd been staked out in it for 48 hours, with nothing to do but look. And they had something else. Something that Marin suspected Steyer had not yet fully accounted for in his data. She would have thought it was arrogance once. She'd have filed it under the same heading as every bad commander she'd ever served under. The assumption that the subjects of analysis were not also analyzing, that the thing being studied could not read the study. That data collection was a one-directional process. But Steyer wasn't arrogant, she thought. Not exactly. He was thorough and methodical and precise. What he was missing was something more specific. He didn't understand adaptation. He was cataloging limits, hard limits, the edges of human physical capacity, and he was doing it with great care. What he'd left out of his model was the thing that happened at those limits. Not breakdown, not the predicted failure cascade. The other thing. The thing that kicked in when the backup systems all failed, and the organism had nothing left, and still found another millimeter of movement. Her mother had called it cussedness. The inability to stop even when stopping was correct. Her drill instructor had called it the stupidest and most valuable quality in the human genome. Marin called it Tuesday. She lay there in the dead grass on the high moor, with the gray sky pressing down, and the alien sphere in the valley below, and Kranz limp in the collector's arms, and she built the plan piece by piece the way she'd been trained, the way experience had refined, the way desperation now sharpened. It was a bad plan. All the best plans were. She rolled onto horses and faced her team. Here's what we're going to do, she said. Daco went first, and he went deliberately. That was the part that cost Marin the most. Standing behind the ridgeline and watching him walk down into the valley in full view, hands visible, rifle on his back. He was bait, and he knew it, and he walked like a man going to meet something he'd already decided to meet, which was a specific kind of courage that didn't announce itself and didn't ask for acknowledgement. Marin had a count going in her head. She hit 50 before the collector broke from its position near the sphere and came up the slope in that looping, mechanical gait. Daco ran. He ran the way they'd planned. Not away, not up the hill, but laterally, across the face of the ridge, drawing the collector on a wide arc that took it away from the sphere's line of sight. Behind Marin, Roth was already moving, staying low, angling down the far side of the ridge toward the secondary approach. He had the sonic tool that Marin had pulled from the emergency kit. Not a weapon, just a frequency emitter. But Roth knew the specific external panel on the sphere's power relay housing, and he knew what frequency disrupted the magnetic seal on it. She'd made him repeat it back to her twice. Marin herself went straight down. She moved fast at it over the open ground, using the dead terrain's natural folds where she could find them, and she was inside the sphere's sensor perimeter before the alarm sounded. At least, before whatever Steyer used for an alarm made itself known as a shift in the sphere's exterior lighting from cold blue to amber. She dropped flat, counted heartbeats, waited. The sphere's door was closed. Inside, she knew Kranz was undergoing something. She didn't let herself think about what. The plan required her to not think about it. The door had a cycle time of 4 minutes once it committed to closing. Roth had counted. She trusted count because counting was something you did when you were staked to the ground with nothing else. You counted. You noted. You built a picture of the thing that was doing this to you, because that was the human response to helplessness. Intelligence gathering, even flat on your back in the dirt with your wrists raw and your throat cracked from thirst. You watched. You listened. You made a model of the enemy because the model was the beginning of the plan. She had 2 minutes left on the door cycle when Steyer came around the side of the sphere. He was shorter than she'd expected. Stocky, low-centered, and he moved with that particular efficiency she associated with things that had been designed rather than born. The armor was a mottled brown-gray, segmented, and the helmet was rounded in a way that made the head look too large for the body, which should have looked comical, and did not. The translation device was a flat disc at the collar junction. His hands, 3 fingers, wide-palmed, moved to something at his belt as he turned, scanning. Marin had one option: keep moving. She went right, fast, staying below his eye line, and made it to the shadow of the sphere's far side before he completed the scan. She pressed her back to the metal, cold even through her jacket, cold like something that had never been warm, and listened to the sound of his feet on the scorched earth. Methodical. Patterned. He walked in the same circuit every time, Roth had said. Methodical. From somewhere across the ridge, she heard the sound of Daco going to ground, the specific clatter of a body hitting rock hard, and her chest tightened. Not the plan. That was not the plan. She heard the collector's legs change rhythm, recalibrating, and she had maybe 90 seconds before it finished its arc and brought Daco back to the sphere. She moved to the power relay housing. It was where Roth said it would be. A panel in the sphere's lower section, chest height, flush-mounted with a handle that required both hands to operate. The magnetic seal was engaged. She could feel the resistance even before she touched it. A subtle push against her palms like repulsion. She pressed the frequency emitter against the seam and triggered it. 3 pulses the way Roth had said. The resistance died. The panel came open. The interior of the relay housing was lit in a pale green that threw her shadow long against the sphere's skin. She looked at it for exactly 1 second, cataloging, finding the component Roth had described. A cylindrical unit, about the size of her forearm, cross-threaded into a port at the back of the housing. Tyrolean diode bypass transformer. The name meant nothing to her. The function was what mattered. Without it, when Steyer returned to the sphere to revitalize, the process would reverse. She reached in. The cylinder was hot. Not burn hot, but hot enough that she registered it as a warning and ignored the warning, and got both hands around it and turned. It resisted. She applied more pressure and felt something shift in her shoulder. Old damage complaining. And she didn't stop. She kept turning, 'cause stop was not in the model right now. Stopping was a word that didn't parse, and the cylinder came free with a sound like a broken seal and a gust of pressurized something that wasn't air. She had it in her hands. She closed the panel, and then Steyer was behind her. She heard the translation device first, the faint modulation that preceded speech. And she turned slowly, because fast movements had a triggering responses that couldn't be untriggered, and she wanted to see him, wanted him to see her, because the next part of the plan required exactly this. "You have removed a component from my ship," Steyer said. The voice that came from the translation device was flat and even sexless, the kind of voice that had no interest in what it was saying. It was a recording device that had learned phonemes. "You will return it." Marin looked at him. "I have cataloged 11 humans on this survey site," Steyer continued. "Your removal of that component will not prevent the completion of my assessment." The data already collected is sufficient for preliminary invasion planning. Return the component and I will proceed with orderly data completion. You said 11, Marin said. You're counting wrong. Something in Steyer's posture shifted. Minute, but she'd learned to read the minute things. You have not been catalogued, he said. No. You have observed the survey operation from concealment for 3 days, and you have built a counter-strategy. It wasn't a question. The flat voice had acquired something. Not inflection exactly, but weight, the way a scale sounds when something unexpected is placed on it. Your physical parameters are inconsistent with optimal performance. You show signs of extended sleep deprivation, caloric deficit, and low-grade cold exposure. These factors should have reduced your operational capacity significantly. Should have, Marin said. She threw the cylinder sideways down the slope and ran. Not away from him, directly at him. She got one hand on the translation device at his collar and pulled, and the disc came free with less resistance than she'd expected. She'd expected armor locked. She'd expected to need more force, but it was consumer-grade fastening and it tore like Velcro, and she pivoted, letting his grab close on air, and went up the slope at a dead sprint. Behind her, Steyer made a sound that the translation device, now in her hands, rendered as something between a command and a statement of fact. She was running too fast to parse it. The collector was somewhere to her right, too far to intercept, and she was over the ridge and down the back slope before the amber light on the sphere went to red. Daco was there. Bleeding from his temple, his left arm held at an angle she didn't like, but standing. Kranz, she said. Door opened. He got out. Roth has him. The relay component? Gone. Down the north ravine. He paused. He's going to know what you did. Yes. He'll go back to the sphere to revitalize, and when he does. Yes. Daco looked at the translation disc in her hands. Is that what I think it is? The data goes through here, Marin said. Everything he's recorded. Every note. Every experiment result. Every piece of intelligence that Fleet is waiting on. She turned the disc over. The port for the outgoing transmission relay was on the underside, exactly where Roth had described the external transmitter coupling. Without the diode, the sphere can't process the revitalization cycle. And without this, the Fleet is blind. The Fleet is blind, she agreed. They heard it then. Not a sound exactly. More like a pressure change, a drop in the ambient frequency of the air, the kind of thing that made teeth ache and dogs bark. It came from the direction of the sphere. What was that? Daco said. Energy discharge, Marin said. She wasn't guessing. Roth had described this too. Had described watching Steyer return to the sphere after an experiment and the sound the revitalization process made. The low, sustained hum of it. This was not a hum. This was an event. This was what happened when power was fed into a process that was missing a critical component. When the cycle committed and the pathway wasn't there. The sphere vented something bright at its base. A pale blue-green that was visible even in daylight. And then the amber running lights went dark. And then everything about the sphere went still in the particular way of things that were no longer functioning. Marin and Daco stood on the ridge and watched it. The pressure in the air faded. After a long moment, Daco said, "Is he?" Yes, Marin said. Another silence, longer. He was going to invade Earth, Daco said. Not a question. Not even really a statement. The tone of a man placing a fact in the correct context so he could look at it properly. He was going to finish his report and transmit it to a fleet, and they were going to use it to plan an invasion, Marin said. Yes, of an empty planet, a planet they wanted. Daco looked at the sphere. The blue-green glow at its base had faded to nothing. They'll know something went wrong. Eventually, when the report doesn't arrive. When the report doesn't arrive, when Steyer doesn't respond to communication. When they send a scout, and the scout finds a non-functional sphere and a field major who failed to account for adaptation in his dataset. Marin looked at the translation disk. He had good data. His method was thorough. He tested limits. He logged results. His report would have been accurate in every technical specification. He just built his whole model on the assumption that the data was static. And it's not. It's never static. She thought of Roth, who had spent 48 hours staked to the ground and used the time to count door cycles. She thought of Zach, whose death had made the rest of them faster and quieter, and more careful and more angry in the specific cold way that anger became useful. She thought of Arak, who was still somewhere in that sphere, and whose absence had made her willing to do things she might otherwise have weighed more carefully. The data changes every time you push it. Every time you test a limit, the organism responds to the test. You can't run an assessment on something that rewrites itself in response to being assessed. Steyer had run experiment after experiment with great precision and had missed that entirely. Had catalogued fluid deprivation and caloric limits and phobic response thresholds, and had written down every result with the careful attention of a scientist, and had not once entered into his model the variable of what the subjects were learning about him while he was learning about them, what they were planning, what they were building, what they would do with what they'd built. Daco was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We should check on Kranz." Yes. They went down the back slope together, and behind them the sphere stood cold and dark in the hollow between the hills, a monument to very thorough science that had forgotten to account for one thing. Kranz was alive. He was sitting against a boulder, with Roth's jacket around his shoulders, and his eyes doing the thing eyes did when they'd seen things they were going to need time to put somewhere manageable. He looked at Marin when she came down to him, and he didn't say anything for a moment, just looked. "The sphere?" he said finally. "Dark," she said. He nodded slowly, like a man filing information. "Then, there were others. He had data on others before us, other humans wherever they came from. Galsec colonies probably, lured in the same way. He had records." Kranz's voice was flat. "He was thorough. I know, he didn't think we'd." He stopped. Tried again. "He didn't think we were." "I know," Marin said. He looked at his hands. They were steadier than Roth's had been, she noticed. Different threshold. Different way of processing. Human variation was a thing Steyer had catalogued at the macro level. Fluid deprivation tolerance, cold exposure duration, but had not examined at the interpersonal level, which was where most of the interesting data actually lived. The way one person's breakdown was another person's quiet anger. The way fear in one unit produced paralysis and in another produced a particular focused clarity. The way grief, specifically, had a conversion rate to tactical capability that no measurement of cortisol levels could fully predict. "Fleet's still out there," Daco said. He'd sat down up on the slope above them, his injured arm cradled. "Fleet's still out there," Marin agreed. "Without the report, without the report, without the assessment, without the data. They know Earth exists. They knew it before Steyer arrived. But they're planning an invasion, and an invasion plan without accurate intelligence is guesswork," Roth said. He'd come down to join them, and there was something different in his face from the man who'd stumbled into their camp 2 days ago. Not recovered. Something else. "They'll guess wrong about us. They'll guess wrong about us," Marin said. "Because the accurate data no longer exists, and even if it did, it was built on a flawed model." She looked at the translation disk in her hand. "There are other ways to get a message to a fleet." The team looked at her. "You want to send them a message," Kranz said. "I want to tell them that their field major is dead, that his assessment is lost, that the planet they're planning to invade has been here before with the beings they're planning to invade, and that if they come, they will not find what they expect." She paused. "I want to do it in his voice, with his translation device, in the format he would have used." A silence. "You think it'll work," Daco said. "I think they'll debate it. Senior commanders who've been waiting on a report are going to sit down with a message saying the report failed, and they're going to argue about what it means. They're going to commission an analysis. They're going to delay, and delay is time, and time is everything." She turned the disk over in her hands. "It's not a permanent solution." "Nothing's permanent," Ruth said. "No, but nothing has to be permanent. It just has to be enough." She held the disk up to the gray sky. "The colony ships on Nerva Station were up there somewhere. There are people waiting for an all-clear that would need to go out differently than planned. The fleet was somewhere beyond that, patient and ordered and certain, in the way of things that had run numbers and believed the numbers. We have time to warn them, to prepare, to make the planet that Steyer described, depopulated, primitive, strategically soft, into something else before they get here." She lowered the disk. "What he didn't understand is that the numbers were already out of date the moment he wrote them. We don't hold still long enough for the data to catch up." Kranz almost smiled. "Almost. That a doctrine," he said. "That's a Tuesday," she said. She sat down in the dead grass and started working out what to say to a fleet. The message took an hour to compose and 3 minutes to transmit. She kept it short. Military language, clipped, the rhythms of a field report. She'd read enough of them in her career to imitate the form. She gave field coordinates. She gave casualty numbers framed as data anomalies. She gave an assessment of human operational capacity that was accurate in all the details Steyer had reported and inaccurate in the single most important way. She described a species whose limits had been comprehensively tested and had not held. She described what had happened to the sphere. She sent it on the frequency Roth had watched Steyer use for his regular updates. In the carrier format the translation disk recognized as official Galsec, or whatever the Sontaran equivalent of official was. Whether it would be believed, she couldn't know. Whether a fleet of conquest would pause for a posthumous field report, she couldn't know. Whether the commanders who received it would see the specific implication threaded through the data, that the surveyor had been neutralized not by weapon or superior force, but by the subjects of his survey, who had spent 3 days as data points and used the time to build a counter-operation. She couldn't know. But she'd spent a career doing things whose outcomes she couldn't know, and she'd learned that the correct response to that was not paralysis. It was Tuesday. Daco's arm was broken. Marin splinted it with 2 flat stones and a length of cable from the collector, which had ceased operation when the sphere went dark and had sat down in the valley like a mechanical exhaustion. Inert, its legs folded under it. Kranz was dehydrated but functional. Roth's hands had mostly stopped shaking by the time they started the climb to the transmat relay point, the path the doctor had used when they'd first come down from Nerva Station. Before all of this, they climbed in silence for a while, and the wind was still coming off the high moor, and the dead grass still hissed, and the gray sky pressed down in the way of a sky that had been doing that for 10,000 years, and didn't particularly need input from the people underneath it. "Do you actually think that'll stop them?" Daco said, after they'd been walking for perhaps 20 minutes. Marin considered this. "I think the message creates doubt, and doubt slows things. They'll come anyway, probably, eventually, after the debate, after the reanalysis, after someone decides the risk is acceptable." She stepped over a fissure in the rock, old damage from when the planet had been remade into the empty, quiet thing it was now. "But we get to be there when they do. We get to decide what they find. That's the thing he didn't account for. That we'd still be here. That we'd still be here. That we'd be different than we were when he started." He ran his assessment, and the assessment was accurate when he ran it and completely wrong by the time it was done. Because the running of the assessment was itself a variable. He poked us and we changed. She paused at the top of a rise and looked back. The sphere was a dark dot in the valley below, too far now to see clearly. You can't build an invasion plan on a study population that edits itself in response to being studied. That's not a limit. That's a fundamental structural problem with the methodology. "You're saying humans are bad at being data," said Dad. "I'm saying we're actively hostile to it," Marin said, "which is different." The transmat relay was where they'd left it. A pad of dull metal, slightly too regular to be natural, set into the rock of the high moor. Marin ran a check on it, found it functional, opened the communication link to Nerva Station. A voice came back almost immediately. Nazreen at the comm board, her tone shifting from professional neutrality to something else when she recognized Marin's voice. "Sergeant Voss, we've been trying to reach you for 2 days. I know, we had a situation. We show only 4 life signs in your team. We're registering 2 medical priorities, 1 broken arm, 1 dehydration. Non-critical, we're ready to come up." A pause. "The all clear for recolonization." "I can't give a clean all clear yet." Marin looked at the relay. "There's a situations report you need to hear before anyone else comes down. I need to speak to Commander Searle directly. He's standing by." "Good." She glanced at her team, Daco with his splinted arm, Roth with his still shaking hands, Kranz with his 1,000-yard eyes. Alive. All 4 of them alive, against odds that Steyer would have computed and found favorable to his side. He'd probably have run the numbers twice to be sure. "Tell him what I'm about to say has implications for colonial security across the sector, and I need full attention." "Understood." Transmitting now. Marin stood on the transmat pad with the wind coming off the moor in the sky, its permanent gray, and the dead grass hissing around her, and she thought about what she was going to say. She thought about the fleet, patient and ordered, and waiting on a report that would never arrive in the form they expected. She thought about the sphere in the valley, dark and finished. She thought about Zach and Arak and what the cost column looked like when you added it up honestly. Because honesty about costs was the thing that kept you from making the same mistakes twice. She thought about Steyer's methodology, thorough, careful, science in the truest sense, and the single flaw at its center, the assumption that human beings were a fixed variable, that once tested, they would hold the test results, that the data would remain valid. Nothing about people was ever static. Nothing about what you could push people to before they hit the limit. And nothing about what happened at the limit. The breaking point and the thing that appeared at the breaking point were not the same thing. They were in fact opposites. He'd mapped the breaking, he'd missed the other thing. She was going to make sure everyone who needed to know knew about the other thing. "Go ahead, Sergeant," Nasreen said. "Commander Searle is on the line." Marin took a breath. "Sir," she said, "I need to tell you about a Sontaran named Steyer, and I need to tell you what happened when he ran out of things he could measure." The transmit hummed beneath her feet, and the wind came off the moor, and above the gray sky, very far away, a fleet waited on a report that was already wrong. She started talking.